Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
The World Data Organization, the world's first international body for data governance, was officially established in Beijing. China launches countermeasures against Japanese lawmaker for undermining China's sovereignty. And Spain has closed its airspace to U.S. military aircrafts involved in strikes on Iran. Welcome to World Today, a news program with a different perspective. I'm Anna in Beijing. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. Our top story. Chinese President Xi Jinping says China stands ready to work with other countries on global data governance, ensuring that the benefits of data development are shared more broadly and serve people worldwide. In a congratulatory letter marking the founding of the World Data Organization, he calls for stronger innovation in digital technologies and a deeper international cooperation to promote the safe, orderly, and efficient flow and use of data. The World Data Organization has held its first general meeting in Beijing as its official establishment. It's the world's first international organization dedicated to promoting data development and governance. So for more on this, joining us on the line is Professor Li Lun, Assistant Professor of Economics at Peking University School of Economics. Thanks for joining us, Professor.
Thanks for having me.
Professor, the World Data Organization is based in Beijing. What does that tell us about the timing and the location? Why Beijing from both China's angle and the global point of view?
Yeah, so from China's perspective, China is actually the most natural policy hub for this organization because we have seen that China has made a lot of improvement in terms of building institutions around data governance, around digital infrastructure and platform regulation. And Beijing is actually the most natural place for these regulations to take place. And also we have seen, for example, other data platforms or data governance has located in Beijing as well. So having the World Data Organization in Beijing is actually putting a very positive signal that China does not only want to be a major digital market, it also wants to participate more actively in the global data governance. And from a global perspective, I think Beijing is also reflecting where the digital governance momentum is shifting because the World Data Organization is the world's first international organization focused specifically on data governance. And Beijing has a lot to offer there because in terms of political visibility, in terms of institutional support, and also in terms of access to China, which is one of the world's largest digital economies. So these factors combined makes it a very natural platform or a meeting point for discussions around the organization and governance for data.
Speaking of the location of his headquarters, Beijing, can we say we are seeing a real shift here from Western-led dominance to something more multilateral in global governance, as some reports suggest, especially since the WDO stresses data sovereignty while, giving developing countries a bigger voice. So how big of a change is this?
Yeah, so I do think it signals a significant shift, but right now at this point, I think it's more incremental. So I don't think the World Data Organization wants to replace the Western influence overnight, but I think the importance is that it widens the institutional table. It gives an additional channel for these conversations to go on, because for a relatively long time, we have seen that all of the rules, especially with regard to trade and right now with respect to data, were shaped disproportionately by a very small number of advanced economies. What the World Data Organization represents is a stronger push for broader participation, especially from developing countries that oftentimes is the rule takers rather than rule makers. So I think also the significance lies in terms of sovereignty, but also in terms of development, because a lot of Western framework focus heavily on privacy, in terms of market openness, in security. But for a lot of developing countries, I think the development itself is a hot issue. So before talking about the privacy issues, so having an accessible data framework is also important. So I think, again, as I said, I don't think it's going to be a big shift from one paradigm to another. I think it's going to offer additional, table or additional institution for equal participation, especially for developing countries.
Indeed. Then building on that, this is the first global organization focused purely on data governance. So what gap is it really filling, and what's the mission of this organization? And how does it fit alongside the institutions or agreements we already have?
Yeah, so I think the main gap here is right now the global data governance has existed, but they have existed in fragments, in pieces, not as a comprehensive system. For example, in terms of WTO, it deals with trade conflicts and all the data governance in terms of trade. The OECD's, also works in the principles for only a selected few countries and also built on trusted data flows. And if we talk about the United Nations, it also, is more targeted to, the political or geopolitical, direction towards data governance. I don't think any of these entities or bodies are exclusively focused on the data governance as a standalone agenda or standalone issue. So that's the institutional gap that the World Data Organization is trying to fill. So I think it's a more specialized platform for dialogue, for rules of coordination, because for example, its stated mission includes bridging the data divide, unlocking the data's value, and also how to power the digital economy. So basically, the entire direction for this institution is basically to make data more productive, to help reduce the gap between norm setting and implementation, to help generate a lot more global discussions and conversations about how to organize and coordinate cross-border data flows, which are oftentimes becoming more and more important in the world.
I think the data gap isn't just about infrastructure, it's also about rules, tech, talent, and governance. So how can the WDO actually help developing countries catch up? And where does China fit into all of this?
Yeah, so I think as you correctly mentioned, the data divide is not just about the infrastructure, but also about all of these regulatory expertise about the what's the best practice in terms of cybersecurity, in terms of standards, and also in terms of the local capacity for governance. So developing countries often need a lot more help in terms of legal framework, in terms of training, in terms of institutional design and technological assistance as well. So not just cables or data centers or servers that they need the entire framework or for practical use, and they need standards, they need trusted exchange between different countries. So I think these lack of system that's not only serves for transforming of data, communication of data, but also for privacy protection, for compliance, for storage of data, for cross-border transfer of data is especially lacking. So I think the World Data Organization can serve as almost like a matchmaking platform between capital, technology, and institutional needs. Because whoever, for example, for the developing regions that needs to have better access to digital economy, to data flow, can meet some other partner that's, for example, interested in investment in those destinations under the same framework. So China can play a major role here because it can provide some public goods rather than just exporting our China's data. For example, we could offer training programs. We could offer, in terms of digital infrastructure, our technical experiences. And we could start pilot projects and also financing mechanisms that could help others build their own capacity in terms of data. So basically, I think China could really make a real difference in terms of this new framework.
Professor, as you earlier mentioned, when we talk about data today, privacy is never far behind. And some countries are very sensitive about data sovereignty and even use that as a weapon in trade. So how can the WDO keep data flowing cross borders while, still addressing those concerns?
Yeah, so I think what WTO or the founding of WTO is solving the incorrect choice, the incorrect binary choice between the free flow of data versus the full control of data. So in reality, when we're talking about cross-border data flows that are sustainable, it requires trust, but it also requires a set of system. For example, in terms of legal systems, intellectual properties protection, digital security, and also national security as well. So the WTO is building a operable trust framework instead of just solving a binary choice between full openness to full control. So I think these we have to create some shared principles for all of the member countries in terms of how to classify these data, how to assess the risks, how to provide the privacy safeguards and privacy standards, and how to give government access to data, and how to most importantly how to handle dispute if there are any dispute between entities. So this framework is actually more important than simply addressing the concern of privacy. And I do think privacy and sovereignty themselves are important issues, but I think they should be considered as foundations or reasons for cooperation, not excuses for protectionism. Because if countries feel like their legal interests and security concerns are respected, then they're more likely to participate in these data sharing arrangements. So that's why I think the World Data Organization's emphasis on compliance, on secure and trustworthy exchange are so important.
That's a great point. To elaborate more on that, how do we turn data into a genuine engine for global growth with data protectionism on the rise and cross-border flows getting hotter?
Yeah, so that's a great question. That's a million-dollar question. So I think to turn the framework or to turn the conversation between understanding data as a zero-sum game or a zero-sum asset to a input that could generate productivity, that's basically how the issue that WTO is really going to focus on. But I think through the regular the new platform, I think there's going to generate more value through more responsible use, more application across different sectors and across borders, and because better governance basically is setting the order for the usage of data. So after you have the better governance, all of these different new technologies and new innovations can prosper because for example, innovations in logistics, in finance, in manufacturing, in healthcare services. So all of these sectors can create its own innovative use of data that could raise productivity, especially when data can move very securely across borders, across sectors, and across systems. So again, this coordinated governance is very essential if we want to have a digital economy that's beyond the one country or one region's border and extend to the entire world.
Thanks for those insightful analysis. That was Professor Li Lun, Assistant Professor of Economics at Peking University. Welcome back to Road Today. China says its countermeasures against a Japanese politician are aimed at safeguarding national interests and are in line with international norms. On Monday, the Foreign Ministry announced sanctions against Keiji Furuya, a member of Japan's House of Representatives. The measures include an asset freeze in China, a visa ban, and a prohibition on Chinese entities engaging with him. Furuya made multiple trips to China's Taiwan region and colluded with separatist forces despite firm opposition from Beijing. China regards the Taiwan question as a core interest and a red line that must not be crossed. Zheng Yibing has more on the Chinese Foreign Ministry's response.
There are two remarks regarding Taiwan by Chinese Foreign Ministry on Monday. The first is on a visit by Japanese lawmaker Keiji Furuya to the Taiwan region of China, and China has frozen Furuya's properties and assets within Chinese territory and denied insurance the visit or entry to him to Chinese territory. And Keiji Furuya colluded with the Taiwan separatist forces blatantly interfering in China's internal affairs and undermining China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The spokesperson Mao Ning said the Taiwan question is at the core of China's core interests and is an unbreakable red line.
After the Japanese leader made erroneous remarks concerning Taiwan, China has repeatedly stated its position. However, KG Furuya continues to act without restraint and persists, including with the Taiwan independence separatist forces, seriously interfering in China's internal affairs and severely infringing on China's sovereignty and core interests.
Well, the Mao Ning said China will also take all other necessary punitive measures based on situation. In response to the visit by 4 U.S. senators to Taiwan, Mao Ning stated China has always firmly opposed official exchanges between the U.S. and Taiwan. And China has already lodged stern representations with the U.S. She said China's position on the Taiwan question is consistent and clear and will take necessary measures to firmly safeguard its sovereignty and territorial integrity.
That was Zheng Yibing reporting. To delve into this, joining us on the line is Dr. Rong Ying, Chair Professor at the School of International Studies at Sichuan University. Thanks for joining us, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
Professor, reports show that KG Furuya has quite a controversial track record, visiting multiple times of Yasukuni Shrine, which enshrines 14 Class A convicted World War II war criminals, and also going to Taiwan despite a strong opposition from Beijing. How do you view this figure, and what kind of forces are backing him?
Well, I think KG Furuya represents small but I think increasingly destructive forces, political forces in Japan, which both in terms of its own development, direction of development, and also in terms of the relationship with the outside world, Asian neighbors in particular. KG Furuya, I think historically, he has a very wrong historical outlook, particularly regarding Japan's sort of a history, this aggression against its neighbors and outside the world. If you look at his positions on the question of comfort women, I think one would not be surprised if you look at its positions on even related to the United States Congress, the so-called 121 resolution adopted by the U.S. House of Representatives in 2007, which explicitly demand the government of Japan to formally acknowledge, apologize, and accept the historical responsibilities in clear and unequivocal manners. But KG Furuya wanted the United States Congress to withdraw that resolution. And on the question of revision of the pacifist Constitution of Japan, again, he has a very strong view on that. Even on the issues of the rights, the political rights of foreign nationals who have a permanent residence in Japan, he also had a question of no. But the most damaging or the problem is that his relationship, his views about Taiwan, which I think touched upon the core principle interest of China, which I think related to the political foundation of relationship between China and Japan. So such a kind of politician, I think the Chinese government had the measures taken against him is not only legitimate and legal in terms of Chinese relevant laws of Chinese, and also I think the international norms. China's decision to sort of put him in a kind of a list that prohibit and sanctions him send a very strong signal that no matter who he is, any attempt or any sort of deeds that undermine China's sovereignty, territorial integrity, particularly on the question of Taiwan, cannot get free. This is a very important message I think the Chinese government sent to Japanese politicians.
Mm-hmm. Professor, we know Furuya is known to be close to Sanai Takaichi, and with all these provocative acts and talks, what does this say about the mindset of Japan's overall right-wing camp?
The Japanese right-wing politicians representing by Keiji Furuya and others, I think they are small in numbers, but their influence are growing, and the impact could be damaging and for Japan and for the outside world. And I think the very purpose for deny the Japanese World War II history of aggression of its Asian neighbors and launching a war, threatening the peace and stability in the world, is meant to, by denying to the history, that part of the history, to seeking sort of the excuse to become so-called a normal state. And also by rejecting that part of the history, I think these right-wing politicians want to seek excuses to pursue the militarization of Japan. And by denying that part of history, by interfering in Chinese internal affairs, I think Japan literally is creating troubles, not only for itself, and we have seen that during the World War II, causing so many destructions, untold sufferings to the neighboring countries, the world at large, but also Japanese themselves. So really, we have to be really careful, being vigilant. And I think Chinese responses is not only meant to defend the sovereignty and territorial integrity, but also to safeguard the justice of humanity. And most importantly, I see to safeguard the peace and the stability in the region and beyond.
Japan says it wants better ties with China, but at the same time allows politicians to keep crossing red lines and backing the so-called Taiwan independence. So how do you rate Takaichi's China policy today, and where might Japan push further in the future?
I think deed speaks much louder than words. We have seen ever since that erroneous remarks by Prime Minister Takaichi. She has repeatedly saying that they want to have a stable relationship with China, is open to talks with China, but it never take concrete, substantial steps to correct the mistakes. I think particularly that the damages to the relationship. And I think China, again, made it very clear they want to have a stable relationship, a normal relationship. But China cannot sacrifice its core interest. But China also does not want to see, I think, these right-wing politicians representing by Keiji Furuya, and also, I think, Prime Minister Takaichi, because of their personal political agenda.
Thanks, Professor Ron Ying. Unfortunately, we ran out of time for the first half of the program. You are listening to Road Today. We'll be back after a short break. You've been listening to Road Today with me, Anna, in Beijing. The OECD has warned that U.S. inflation could surge to 4.2% this year, the highest in the G7. At the heart of the concern is the risk of disruption to critical supply routes like the Strait of Hormuz, a key artery for global oil and gas flows. Higher energy prices are already rippling through supply chains, raising the risk of a broader and more persistent inflation in the U.S. economy. Several institutions have also raised the risk of U.S. recession. Moody's estimates a 48.6% chance of a recession within 12 months, while Goldman Sachs puts the risk at 30%. So for more on this, my colleague Zhao Yang spoke with Yan Liang, professor of economics at Willamette University.
So, Yan, the OECD warns U.S. inflation could hit 4.2% this year, the highest in G7. So what is driving this outlook?
Well, the largest reason is because of the Iran war and the restrictions of the Strait of Hormuz when it comes to global logistics. So even though the United States is relatively self-sufficient in energy, it is a net exporter of oil and refined products of oil. But still, because the oil market is very much interconnected at the global stage, so when the oil price is rising, the United States is not immune from that. So we already saw the average gas price in the United States has gone up by more than $1 since the war started, from close to $3 dollar a gallon to now $4 a gallon. And so that will filter through into the broader economy. In addition to that, I think there are also other commodity prices are likely to rise. For example, fertilizers and various industrial products and ingredients. So I think overall, because of the war, because of the the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, this puts a lot of inflationary pressure all over the world. And the United States, because it already has some inflationary pressure before entering the war, right? As we know, with Trump's administration's tariff, there are a lot of costs that are right now absorbed by enterprises. So they're already trending a sort of a thin margin. And now with this war and with rising costs of fuels and other industrial supplies, they're very likely to pass these costs on to the consumers and also add even more in terms of profit margins. So I think that overall, it means higher inflationary pressure in the United States.
And how exactly does the U.S. Israeli strike on Iran translate into the U.S. inflation at the consumer level?
Well, I think, as I mentioned earlier, the biggest channel is through the oil and gas price. So again, in the United States, these are really essential because the U.S. is very, oil dependent when it comes to its transportation industries, its industrial production, its households, and so on and so forth. So with the rising fuel price, this is going to translate into, higher energy costs. And as a result of that, the many sectors are going to be affected. Then I think the fertilizer, we already saw some of the key ingredients for fertilizers, especially the ureans and ammonians. So all of these prices have been rising, and so that would translate into higher costs for the agriculture sector, which means food price is going to rise. And as we know, the agriculture sector is very energy dependent. It's not only needing the fuels to operate the machines, farming machines, but also it is very energy intensive to produce fertilizers and pesticides. So all of this would translate into higher agricultural production costs, as well as a result of that, higher food price. And I think in addition to that, because of Strait of Hormuz is so important for global logistics, and a lot of the oil byproducts that are going into the production of plastic or semiconductor and other high-tech chips, high-tech products. So with all these restrictions and supply shortages, that would translate into higher costs of these industrial supplies. So I think all of these, going from fuel price to fertilizer price to industrial key ingredients, all of this are putting higher pressure on the U.S. economy. And so these costs will be passed on to consumers. And therefore, the consumers are going to eventually foot the bill and bear the main brunt. When you look at the Michigan University's consumer sentiment, you already saw the consumer sentiment has dipped down in March to the lowest in 3 months. And consumers are also expecting the inflation to reach 3.8% this year, which is the highest expectation since April last year. Now, of course, the OECD is expecting even a higher inflation rate for the United States at 4.2% in 2026. So overall, I think, there's a higher inflationary pressure, and there's also a higher inflation expectation. So that means it's very likely the kinds of inflation will become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
The high inflation expectations. So does that force the Federal Reserve to rethink their monetary policy, the interest rate cuts?
I think so. I think that overall, if the inflation rate is reaching, 4.2%, which is way higher than the Fed's, targeted rate at 2%, then the Fed would have no choice but to follow, their dual mandate to raise interest rate. Now, not that raising interest rate is going to help to dampen inflation, but that's pretty much their playbook. Now, I think that there's some very prominent economists like Rubini from the NYU. He believes that the U.S.'s escalation of the Iran war the probability is going to be over 50%. As we also know, Trump is now mobilizing over 3,500, troops, ground troops to invade Iran. So with the escalation of war, with the war, projects and drags on, then the inflation pressure will be even higher. So that means the Fed will then, have to raise interest rates. Now, I think the ECB, given that they don't have the dual mandate, right? All they have is inflation target. They are very clear that if the Iran war, it's not, end by June, then the ECB will have to raise interest rate. I think Lagarde, the ECB president, has also made the same pronouncement that if the war wages on and inflationary pressure rises, then the ECB will have to raise the interest rate.
And Moody's now put the risk of a U.S. recession at nearly 50%. So what do you think about this assessment? And beyond the near-term outlook, what are the deeper structural challenges for the U.S. economy?
Well, I think that there is always a possibility. Now, I think the difficulty is, of course, the uncertainty about how long this war is going to last. So, from the very beginning, President Trump talked about a special operation finished in 48 hours. And now you hear the Vice President, J.D. Vance, even mention things like, we're not going to have a war that lasts more than 1 or 2 years. So it's very clear the timeline of the war is unpredictable, uncertain, and it's likely to be quite extensive. So that means the impacts on the economy is going to loom large. Now, the OECD is still giving quite optimistic, forecast for the U.S. economy at 2.0% of growth rate in 2026. But again, I think that is because they think that, the tech-driven productivity growth, the AI expenditure, and also the relatively strong consumer spending will help to, bolster the economy. But I think that as long as the war is, dragging on, then a lot of these assumptions will be challenged. So in other words, if the war continues on with the blockade, with the global supply chain being disrupted, and with the consumer sentiment and also investor confidence got shaken, then I think that would really have a significant negative impact on the U.S. economy. So in terms of going long term, I think, again, even though the U.S. economy is relatively, energy sufficient, but they're very much behind in terms of the green energy and renewable energy development. And now they're counting a lot on this AI expenditure. But whether or not AI can really translate into higher productivity growth and how AI's negative impact on jobs can be reduced, I think all of these would pose certain challenges on the U.S. economy. Not to mention, I think if the war really does drag on, it's going to also have significant fiscal implication on the U.S. economy. So that means, if the government continue to spend on this war efforts, it may have to cut other spendings on the social programs or other non-military spending, and also continue to, increase the federal spending and debt. So all of this, I think, would have strong implications for the U.S. economy going forward. So I would say the 2% forecast is quite optimistic.
And the U.S. Israeli strikes on Iran has led to disruptions of roughly 20% of the world's oil and LNG supply. So how does this influence the development of renewable energy?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think over the medium and long term, definitely the idea of, promote more renewable energy, in a way diversify the kinds of energy sources that countries could have, I think it's definitely a strategic choice. It's a very important for countries to think about that. And I think China is definitely play a very pivotal role in this. As we know, China now is the largest investor and producer of renewable energies. And, China is able to rescale up the production of these green products and also, develop green energies. So I think that would help other countries to have more affordable, energy solutions, especially countries from the global south.
That was Yan Liang, professor of economics at Willamette University. Spain has closed its airspace to U.S. warplanes involved in strikes on Iran. Spanish Defense Minister Margarita Robles says the U.S. and Israeli attacks are illegal and unjust.
Bueno, creo que todo el mundo sabe cuál es la posición española.
I think everyone knows what the Spanish position is. It is a very clear position. From the very first moment, it was made very clear to the American military and forces, and therefore, the bases are not authorized, and of course, the use of Spanish airspace for actions related to the war in Iran is also not authorized.
Spain's economy minister says the restriction forms part of a broader government decision not to participate in or support what it describes as a unilateral war that violates international law. So for more on this, let's bring in Kamol Makili-Aliyev, Associate Professor at the School of Global Studies at the University of Gothenburg. Professor, Spain isn't just blocking warplanes and refueling aircraft linked to the strikes on Iran from using its military bases. It also shutting its airspace to U.S. planes coming from places like the United Kingdom and France. So what kind of impact does this have on the war and the United States?
Well, Spain's decision has both operational and strategic consequences. Operationally, it forces the United States to reroute its military aircraft, including those based in countries like United Kingdom and France, as you mentioned. That affects the refueling chains. It increases the flight times and it reduces flexibility for United States. It's not crippling because the United States has alternatives, but it does raise the cost and complexity of operations. More importantly, however, it's the political impact because it's much larger. This is a clear signal that United States access to allied infrastructure is no longer automatic, especially for operations that are seen as lacking a legal justification. That marks a shift in how NATO cooperation functions in practice.
Mm-hmm. Professor, reports indicate that in the weeks leading up to U.S. Israeli strikes on Iran, Madrid and Washington had intense talks with Spain refusing from the start to support what it sees as an unlawful operation against Iran. Now it's closing its airspace. So what message is Spain sending to the world? And do you think that other countries will follow the suit, especially those in Europe?
Well, Spain is sending a very deliberate legal and political signal. Madrid has explicitly framed the U.S. Israeli strikes as both illegal and unjust. And by denying both bases and airspace, it's very clearly demonstrating that this is not just Spanish rhetoric. It is effectively saying that, first of all, international law matters. Then allies are not obliged to support all United States operations, especially if they're not taken collectively as a NATO membership dictates. And then that Europe can act with strategic autonomy when it disagrees. Or at least, some countries can. So the message is broader than Iran. It's about redefining the terms of alliance behavior in a more multipolar and contested world. Will other countries follow? It's hard to tell, but there already are signs in countries like Germany and Belgium, for example, that have a strong position that can push the whole of the governments to adopt similar stances.
Mm-hmm. A lot of European leaders have criticized the U.S. and Israel, but Spain is actually taking action. Why Spain? Why does its position seem more concrete and consistent among European nations?
Well, I don't want to sound too trivial, but because Spain has basically aligned its policy with action, while many other countries, especially in the European Union, have not. And several European governments have expressed concern, that is true. But Spain is among the few that, taking concrete material steps, right, that we've seen in the closing airspace, denying the logistical support. I think it shows that Spain has a stronger commitment to multilateral legality, first and foremost. It also shows that there is a strong domestic political pressure in Spain against involvement in the Middle East wars. And we've seen that previously. It's right now, I think, on the peak. And there is also a desire in Spain to position itself as a leader of European strategic autonomy. They have been very vocal about this and they're kind of snatching the initiative from Germany and France in this sense. So Spain is not necessarily more critical than the other countries, but it's more willing to act on the criticism, which gives its position much greater credibility. So it's a very important Spanish play.
Professor, as you earlier mentioned, other European nations or NATO countries are uneasy too. Germany's Chancellor Merz has warned of pressures similar to COVID or the early Ukraine crisis if things escalate. Meanwhile, Washington is still pressing its allies. So where do U.S.-NATO relations stand right now?
I actually written a small essay about this. And as I mentioned and predicted, we are seeing, visible strain, but not a breakdown in the U.S.-NATO relations. On core issues, on most of the core issues, including, for example, war in Russia, NATO remains quite cohesive. But on the Middle East, we are seeing the divisions, and they're becoming more pronounced. I think Spain's move and broader European criticism show that alliance unity is conditional, not automatic, like it was before. And at the same time, Washington, I think, has reportedly responded with pressure and including, threats of economic measures against allies that do not cooperate. Although how much of these threats are credible is also another question. But that introduces a more transactional dynamic into the alliance, right? Less value-based and more transactionality based. So overall, I think it's a moment of a recalibration. NATO still holds quite a lot of structure and cohesiveness, but politically it's more fragmented than has been in years.
Professor, we see things are escalating fast. Iran is looking to charge ships in the Strait of Hormuz and block U.S. and Israeli vessels. Washington is threatening to completely destroy Iran's oil facilities. And Israel says its operations are entering a final phase, now targeting economic infrastructure of Iran. So where is this heading? Is this really going to end as neatly as Israel and the U.S. expect?
Probably not, because the trajectory is clearly escalatory and increasingly systemic. So we're basically seeing is, first of all, rising tensions around the Strait of Hormuz, with threats to global shipping, combined with sharp increase in oil price and market volatility, and then U.S. threats to target Iran's energy infrastructure and Iranian moves towards asymmetric retaliation. This clearly shows the escalation ladder. And this suggests that the conflict is evolving from a military confrontation into economic and regional warfare on not just the military scale, but on the hybrid scale. So that makes a quick and smooth resolution very unlikely. And I think instead we're likely entering in the phase of a prolonged instability with global economic consequences, where the conflict is as going to be regarded from the position of how well it's managed and how well it's contained without actually exploding into more military crashes on the regional level. So it remains to be seen, but as I said, the ladder is escalatory.
Thanks, Professor, for those valuable insights. That was Kamol Makili-Aliyev, Associate Professor at the School of Global Studies at the University of Gothenburg. The Palestinian Authority is condemning Israel's new death penalty law, calling it a dangerous shift toward legalizing genocide. It comes after Israel's parliament passed a law permitting the death penalty for Palestinians convicted of deadly attacks. The move has drawn strong international criticism. Several European governments have called the law discriminatory, saying it would have no deterrent effect. Supporters in Israel say the measure is intended to deter terrorism, but critics warn that it could further inflame tensions between Israelis and Palestinians. So for more on this, my colleague Gao Yingshi spoke with Zhang Chuchu, Deputy Director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Fudan University.
Thank you, Professor Zhang Chuchu, for joining us. So why has Israel chosen to pass this law at this moment? What political or security factors are driving it now?
Right, I think this law is a core demand coming from the far-right Jewish Power Party, which is led by the National Security Minister Ben-Gvir, who has long championed it as a key condition of the coalition agreement. So currently, we can see that Ben-Gvir celebrated its passage by handing out, the proposal in the Knesset and even wore a symbolic label pin during debates. So right now it means that Netanyahu's narrow coalition heavily relies on these far-right partners for survival. So for him, passing the bill helps him stabilize the government at the moment, fulfills a major ideological pledge, and also it helps him shore up political support ahead of the expected election later this year.
The Palestinian Authority condemned the law's adoption, saying Israel has no sovereignty over Palestinian land. What does this law represent from the Palestinian perspective?
Well, from the Palestinian viewpoint, actually, the law represents a very dangerous escalation, and also it's just like a provocative step towards formal annexation, because it violates the Fourth Geneva Convention by unilaterally applying Israeli domestic criminal law to the occupied territory where Israel has no recognized sovereignty under international law. And right now, critics argue that it institutionalizes systematic discrimination by creating a two-tier justice system, one that imposes the death penalty almost automatically on Palestinians in military courts, whereas Jewish Israelis accused of similar crimes continue to be tried under ordinary Israeli civilian law.
Ministers of Australia, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy urged Israel not to go ahead with this law. Why has it drawn such strong international backlash?
Indeed, we can see a lot of Western countries expressing their dissatisfaction. And this is because in their eyes, this kind of law violates the international law, because by legislating directly in the occupied West Bank, which is a territory over which Israel has no sovereignty under international law, the bill is widely viewed as de facto annexation. And also it constitutes a clear breach of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which prohibits an occupying power from extending its domestic laws to protected persons and guarantees fair trial protections for civilians under occupation. And on the other hand, the many Western countries, they are also concerned with the democratic and human rights erosion. A lot of rights groups, the European Union and the United Nations experts have warned that the law risks transforming military courts into instruments of irreversible punishment, which might remove judicial discretion and due process safeguards. So I think this reflects a coordinated Western concern that the legislation further entrenches occupation policies, and it might seriously complicate any future peace process in Gaza.
Supporters argue that this law will help counter terrorism and act as a deterrent. Do those arguments hold up in practice?
In fact, in practice, these arguments face significant challenges, and they lack strong empirical support, because in fact, there is no credible evidence to show that the death penalty deters violent crime or terrorism more effectively than life imprisonment without parole. And also, many ideologically driven attackers, especially those motivated by extreme narratives, are unlikely to be deterred by the threat of execution. And also, so far, if we look at what's going on in Israel and Palestine, we can see a lot of Palestinian groups such as Hamas and Islamic Jihad. They have already responded by calling for revenge attacks, which suggests that the law may escalate rather than reduce violence in the short term. So it is very unlikely to improve Israel's security situation and might instead heighten tensions in the region.
Now, despite the warning from the Western countries and also dissatisfaction from Palestinian side, the law has been passed. What should we be watching next? So what consequences could it have inside Israel and also for the broader Palestinian situation?
Indeed, after the law has been passed, right now the law is set to enter into force within approximately 30 days. So I think there are a lot of key developments which might need to be watched closely in the coming days. The first thing is within Israel itself, I think this law deepens political polarization because the far right, they claim a major ideological victory, whereas the opposition parties and the centrist voices, they warn of democratic erosion and moral damage. And also, this action might temporarily stabilize Netanyahu's coalition, but it risks a constitutional crisis, especially if the Supreme Court strikes it down or significantly limits it. In fact, this kind of law actually, it violates the constitutional principles of Israel, because at the very beginning, a lot of observers, they claim that Israel is a country in the Middle East which values democracy, human rights, rule of law, etc. But currently, since this law has been passed, right now a lot of people, especially the European experts, Australian experts, right now they're questioning it, and they are also questioning the democratic situation in Israel. On the other hand, as for the Palestinian situation, right now we can see heightened tensions and possible spikes in attacks or protests in the West Bank. That might happen. And also, so far, the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, and the militant factions have already condemned it as a war crime and provocation. And at the same time, I think the law also risks escalating the cycle of violence in Palestine, especially in West Bank, which could complicate the ceasefire efforts or any long-term negotiations. And last but not least, I think it might also strain relations with the European partners, given that they have already expressed their strong opposition to the law.
That was Zhang Chuchu from Fudan University, spoke with my colleague Gao Yingxu. That's all the time for this edition of Word Today. I'm Anna in Beijing. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.